bad when the preacher comes up to the pulpit. Didn't our music team do a fantastic job as always this morning? They always do a great job. It's always, that's my favorite part. I love to preach, but my favorite part is worship because it just helps me. It just really encourages me. And I hope you feel the same. Today, I'm not going to tell you I'm not going to preach very long because every time I do that, I end up going an hour. I don't want to lie to you. But today, I'm going to get right to the point with my sermon today. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 18. And this sermon today, my entire intention is for it to build your faith. As I was praying the other day, I was telling some of the Taylor and my mom, and just probably a week ago from Wednesday, I had felt really depressed by the Lord to just kneel at my bed and pray. Nobody was home but me, and usually I'm up early in the morning. I do my prayer time anywhere from 6:30 to 7, anywhere in that nature. So usually my prayer time is being done and over, and about 10 o'clock, 10:30, I just felt real burdened. And I felt the Lord impressing me to get my prayer list, which all of your names are listed on it, and my family. And I knelt at my bed and I just began to pray. And it was one of those moments that I just kind of got lost in the spirit of it. And next thing I knew, 45 minutes later, I had been kneeling at my bed and I'd been praying. I was crying and the Lord was praying through me. I was praying in my prayer language. And there were so many things going through my mind that I so clearly heard just this phrase in my spirit as I was praying for a certain situation, and I just heard this phrase, is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too hard for the Lord? Now when I heard that, I thought, okay, that, I know I've heard that somewhere. I know it was the Lord, but I know I've heard that somewhere else. So I went back to my office once I was done praying, and I went and I started searching, and I found this question in the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 18, verse 10 through 14. And verse 14 is the one that I'm going to focus on the most. Starting with verse number 10, and he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. Sarah was listening in the tent door which was behind them. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, After I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And the Lord said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I surely bear a child since I am old? And here it is. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Now, background of this story, you've all heard it before, that Abraham and Sarah are in the midst of a transition. They had left their home of Ur, and they were traveling to a land that God would show them. So they're traveling in a direction they've never been. They're going to a people they've never known, and they're just following the steps of God. And even in the midst of all this, they're well advanced in age. When God called Abraham, he was anywhere between 70 and 75. And at this point in the story, they've been traveling about 25 years. And in the midst of their travel, God had promised these two individuals that they would have a son, because he promised them that out of their loins would proceed a nation that would bless the earth. But as the years passed by, and the more they did, it seemed the less they reaped, and there was no sign of a child. And at this point in the story, Abraham is about 99 and Sarah is about 90. And here, God has shown up. The Trinity, most scholars believe, showed up in the form of three men. And they were speaking with Abraham. And in their conversation, the Lord tells Abraham, you're going to have a son by this time next year. Now, Sarah, she's an old woman. The Bible says she's past the age of childbearing, and most scholars will tell you that means she has already gone through the change. Most of you ladies know what it means, the change. And so she knows in her mind, it is physically impossible. There is absolutely no way, me being 90, him being 99, there is no way possible that we're going to have a son at this age. And so she laughs. But God hears her. And he confronts her and Abraham you laugh? And if you read on, Sarah tried to deny it. He said, no, you laugh. And he confronts them with this question, is anything too hard for the Lord? Now, how many of you have ever questioned God? Those of you who ain't raising your hands, that's okay. I know you have. It's all right. I have never been one to, quote unquote, question God as in his authority. But I have asked him questions before, like you. Like you were telling your story. God, but I, but this, but that. And I ask God questions. We all do, and when we ask him questions, we ask him expecting a response. But what do you do when God asks you a question? When God asks a question, how do you respond to that? What kind of response is God expecting? In the Bible, God asks questions many times. One of the most prominent ones is in Genesis after the fall of man. He said, Adam, where are you? Now, if you're like me, I question that and say, now God's all-knowing. He's all-powerful, so why would he have to ask where Adam is? He should know. And it's not that he asked the question because he didn't know. It's because he was asking to invoke a response in faith from Adam. So in this situation, when he's asking Abraham and Sarah, is anything too hard for the Lord? He's not asking for a religious platitude of saying, well, Lord, no. We tend to do that. We know what answer we're expected to give, do we not? We've been in church enough to where we know how to answer certain questions. We know how to do church. We know how to be religious. But God asked this question not in order to invoke a verbal response or even a physical response, but to invoke a response of faith. Because they've been traveling for years and they had been waiting on a promise, and it was delayed year after year, time after time, age after age, they didn't have a child. And so God asked Abraham and Sarah this question in order to find out where their faith was. Because they had waited so long, was their faith still in God or had it shifted? Was their faith still trusting and believing him for their miracle, even though it looked impossible? So many times we are guilty of viewing God's power in light of our own ability. In so many different situations, we are guilty of comparing God to us. What do I mean by that? Well, there are certain situations that are easy to give to God. They're easy to say, God can control this, because in reality, we know he can control it because we can control it. Are y'all out there? It's easy for us to give him power when we know that, well, if he doesn't show up, I can fix it myself. We know in certain small situations that we'll give it to God because we know that if God decides to do it differently, then we can fix it with our money, with our own power, with our own authority. And so that's easy to give to God because it really doesn't matter if he shows up or not. We tend to think that as long as we have authority, as long as we have control, then the same is true for God. But what do you do when you face an impossible situation? Our tone tends to change, does it not? When we're facing a difficulty that all of a sudden rises up and we know there is no way we're going to be able to handle it. We know no amount of money, no amount of effort, no amount of authority, nothing can change this situation, and so we feel out of control. We feel totally helpless, and whether we want to admit it or not, in those times, even though we'll say, well, we're praying about it, or we're doing this, or we're trusting God, the reality is we're really doubting because we're thinking, I feel out of control, so he must feel out of control. Hello, somebody? We think that because it appears impossible to us, then surely it must be impossible for God. Because it's difficult in our own power, I wonder if God is really able to handle this. That's why Sarah laughed. Sarah laughed because she said, this is too hard for me to do. It's impossible for me. There's no way that's going to happen. But then God shows up into her situation and in ours today and asks the question, is anything too hard for the Lord? It may look impossible to you, but do you really think it's impossible for me? It may look too big for you, but you forget I'm the one, says the Lord, who put the stars in place. It may look impossible from human perspective, but when you look at it from God, and you realize He's the one who dug out the Grand Canyon with His hand. You realize He's the one that spoke and the earth became into existence. And the earth is hanging on merely His word. But yet we want to talk about it's impossible for God. The creator of the universe. The Alpha and Omega. The beginning and the end. We think because it is hard for us, then surely it must be hard for Him. But He shows up and He asks the question, is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too difficult for me to handle? Is any situation really too large that I cannot show up and show my power? Whether you realize it or not, the Scripture is full of answers to that question. From Genesis to Revelation, there are occasion after occasion that answer the question, is anything too hard for the Lord? If you want to know if anything's too hard for the Lord, then just go to Joseph, who was one of Jacob's sons. And they were all jealous of him because he was a dreamer. And God had shown him that he would one day rule over his brothers and his parents. And they got jealous of him and they threw him into a pit. And out of the pit, they sold him into slavery. And out of slavery, he went to the prison. But as year after year went by, Joseph didn't give up because he knew God had made him a promise. And eventually, God showed up in the prison and He took him from the pit to the palace. So I want to ask you, is anything too hard for the Lord? If you're wondering, then go and ask Moses, who when he's coming out of Egypt with over 600,000 Israelites, and they're standing at the Red Sea, and they're getting ready to cross over, and all of a sudden they hear the sound of hooves and chariots, and here comes Pharaoh with his army, and the people start crying out, and they say, have you taken us out of Egypt to let us die in the wilderness? And they're wondering, where's God? He put 10 plagues. He did all this. But here we are. The wilderness is on our left and right. The Red Sea's in front of us. And Pharaoh's army's behind us. We're between a rock and a hard place. There's no way out of this. There's no way we're going to get through this. But then God showed up and He said, watch this. And He put a pillar of fire to block Pharaoh's army. And He told Moses, raise your staff. And the Red Sea parted. And over 600,000 individuals walked on dry ground. And not only were they delivered from their enemy, but they got to watch their enemy drown. And they never saw them again. So let me ask you, is anything too hard for the Lord? Why don't you go and ask Job, who had said that the enemy wanted to attack him, and he took everything he had, his health, his wealth, and his family. He totally bankrupted him. All he left him with was a negative wife and negative friends. He completely tore him down. And Job sat there and he wondered what had happened. He asked, why, God? What's going on? And it seemed impossible. But it says at the end of the book of Job that Job's latter half was greater than his former. Because God restored double what the enemy had stolen. So let me ask you, is anything too hard for the Lord? Why don't you go and ask Hezekiah, who had gangrene in his feet, and he'd been dealing with sickness, he'd been dealing with his health, and finally it called up to him, and Isaiah showed up and said, get your house in order, you're about to die. Now most of us would have given up right then and started picking out songs for our funeral. If a prophet tells you you're about to die, we just say, well, that's it, it's over. But not Hezekiah. It said he turned his face toward the wall. Scholars say he looked toward the temple and he prayed to God. And before Isaiah was ever able to get out of the court of the kingdom, he said, go back and tell Hezekiah, I will extend his life 15 years. So let me ask you, is anything too hard for the Lord? Why don't you ask David, the little shepherd boy who had never been trained in battle, who had never once each other, and nothing's going on because Israel had a giant problem. They had Goliath standing there, taunting them, insulting them, and telling them, you'll never be able to beat me. You'll be our slave for the rest of your life. And David heard the blasphemies, and he said, God's going to take this one out because God will not allow a blaspheming, uncircumcised Philistine to blaspheme his people or his name. And he gets 5 smooth stones and a sling, and God takes down a giant problem with just a sling and a stone, and the victory's won. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Why don't you ask Elijah, who when he's running from Jezebel, and he's depressed, and he's down, and he's out, and he don't know what's going to happen because there's famine in the land, there's a drought, and he don't know how he's going to eat. But it said that for months, God kept him by the brook Cherith, and he drank from the spring, and every day ravens brought him bread from the king's table. Can I tell you, sometimes God will strip your enemies to bless you? Hello, somebody. Sometimes God will take from your enemies to bless you, but you got to stay faithful. You got to keep holding on. So let me ask you, is anything too hard for the Lord? Why don't you ask the 3 Hebrew boys when they stood before Nebuchadnezzar, and he said, if you don't bow, I'm going to throw you in the furnace. And they said, we will not bow. And whether we die or whether we live, we know our God is faithful. Our God will see us through. And they knocked the furnace up 7 times hotter. And it said they threw him in there. And Nebuchadnezzar said, did we not throw 3 in there? Yes, sir. Well, I see 4 walking about in the flames, and one looks like the Son of Man. And they came out of the furnace, not a hair on their head was singed, and they didn't even smell like smoke. Let me ask you, is anything too hard for the Lord? Why don't you ask Daniel, who when he started praying, Cyrus had the king of Persia had to throw him into the lion's den, and all night long God shut the mouths of the lions in order to keep his servant Daniel. Let me ask you, is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too hard for the Lord? Why don't you go and ask Mary? Mary was a virgin. But God said, you will be with child. Physically impossible. There's no way a virgin woman is going to be able to conceive a son. It's impossible, Lord. But yet, she was overcome by the Holy Spirit, and she brought forth the Son of God, the Messiah, the Lamb that was slain from the foundations of the earth. And even though it looked impossible, God showed up and made the impossible possible. Let me ask you, is anything too hard for the Lord? Ask the woman with the issue of blood, who for 12 years she was hemorrhaging. For 12 years she bled, and she wasted all of her money on doctors. She completely bankrupted herself and never got any better. But one day she heard Jesus was passing by. And the Bible says she said to herself, if I can but touch the hem of his garment, I'll be made well. And when she reached out and touched him, it said that her iniquity, her infirmity dried up from that very moment, and she was totally healed. So is anything too hard for the Lord? Why don't you ask Lazarus? He was sick, and his sisters called for Jesus. And they said, come, the one you love is sick, and he waited until Lazarus died. And he'd been in the grave 4 days when he showed up. And Jesus said, roll back the stone. They said, but Lord, he's been dead these 4 days. He'll stink. And he said, roll back the stone. Jewish law said that there's no way, spiritually or physically possible, a spirit could be resurrected after 3 days. But 4 days, Jesus showed up. And all he did was say, Lazarus, come forth. And there come Lazarus, walking out in grave clothes, more alive than he ever was. What's your point, Brother Drake? I've come by here to tell you there's nothing too hard for God. There's no situation too impossible. There's no obstacle too big. Come on, we can pray. We can pray more than that. Is anything too hard for the Lord? way it would ever happen. But every time, are you hearing me today? Every time God showed up and what looked impossible became possible. Yeah. An unsolvable situation, an uncertain circumstance became a miracle because God intervened. Every time it became impossible, God did his greatest work. Can I tell you that what you see as impossible is just a platform for God to do a miracle? When God wants to do the miraculous, he gives you the impossible. When God wants to show his hand strong, Tyler, he gives you a situation that you know beyond a shadow of a doubt there's no way that it's going to happen without God. Now, when you need a miracle, God will give you a platform of the uncertain so that he knows in the end that when it's done, all glory goes to him and not you. Tina, when he wants to do something strong in you, when he wants to just show up and show out, he'll give you a situation that nobody else can see a way out of. But when he shows up, they'll say, but God, because it's only by his hand, only by his strength, only by his ability could this happen. What you see as impossible is just making you a candidate for a miracle. I figured y'all received that better than that. What you see as impossible is just a situation for you to be a candidate for a miracle. Nothing is too hard for the Lord. There's nothing he can't handle. The same God who gave Sarah a baby can get you out of your circumstance. The same God who split the Red Sea for Moses and the Israelites can perform a miracle in your life. The same God who slayed the giant can slay that giant in your life. The same God who showed up and raised Lazarus from the dead is the same God that can raise your dead situation. The Bible says in Luke 1:37, for nothing shall be impossible with God. Now we tend to take that and we tend to hyphenate nothing. And we tend to say no thing is impossible with God. But that's not how it's translated. It literally translates as nothing. Because we always talk about God can do anything, but there's one thing God cannot do, and that's nothing. Hello? God can do everything, but one thing, and that's nothing. You know what that tells me? That tells me on Monday nights when we're praying at these altars that we're not going to get up and get nothing. That tells me that when we fast on the first of the month, we're not going to get nothing in return. That tells me when I'm trusting God and I'm holding to the horns of the altar that I'm not going to come up with nothing, that I'm going to come up with something because my God is able and he will do it for me. Impossible with God. There is no sickness too big for him to heal. There's no doctor's report too large for him to turn around. There's no person too big for him to save. There is nothing that God cannot do. He can do it all. There's nothing too hard for the Lord. There's never been a situation he couldn't overcome, and there's never been a condition that he could not reverse. Amen. There's never been a sickness known to man that God could not heal. There's never been a bondage that God could not deliver us out of. Sister Betty, it might confound the doctors, but it don't confound you. Amen. Ray, it may make our family and our co-workers say, what in the world? But it don't make him. Keena, to everybody else, it may seem like she's done. It's over. She's out for the count. But God says, wait and watch this, honey, because I'm able to do exceedingly abundantly all you can believe, ask, or think. But here is the catch. God can do anything only if you believe. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Without faith, nothing is possible. But with faith in a big God, everything is possible. Where's your faith this morning? That situation that's got you overwhelmed and overrun and got you questioning, where's your faith in that situation? That report you got on Monday that's weighing on your mind all week long, where's your faith in that? That call you got from the bank that says you're almost overdrawn and we can't help you, we don't know what we're going to do, where's your faith in that? Where's your faith when they say we got to let you go and we had to let all these other people go too? We can't give you any compensation, we can't help you, there's nothing we can do. Where's your faith in that? Where's your faith this morning? How will you answer this question? When God asks you, which He's asking you now, is anything too hard for the Lord? What's your answer? How are you going to answer that question? It's impossible. There's no way. It ain't going to happen. Or is it, God, by your power, by your strength, by your hand, all things are possible to him that believes. Misty, I'm almost done. Whenever you're ready. I did not come by here this morning to get deep, to give you some kind of theological discourse. I come by here this morning to build your faith. Because every one of you, whether I know it or not, you're going through something that you know God has to show up or it ain't going to happen. My family itself is walking through a situation that we know God has to intervene. Medical science can only go so far. Treatments can only go so far. Doctors can only do so much. But my God, who spoke the earth into existence, who named the stars and knows them by name, my God, who knows the very numbers on my head. My God, who knew me before I was even created in my mother's womb. My God, who always has and always will be. My God can do anything. Amen. There's nothing too hard for the Lord. Nothing is impossible if you believe. This morning, my whole prayer this week is, God, let the impossible happen today. God, not for me, not so that people can glorify me, not so that people can say Drake did it, but so that they can say, God did. I've asked him to heal some people today. Not by me. I've asked him today to deliver some people today. I've asked him to give some people some phone calls that looked impossible as soon as they walk out of this door. I've asked him, Lord, do what only you can do. And so this morning, I purposely did not want to preach long because I wanted to have time in the altars. If you need to go, God bless you. We love you. Go on. But I wanted to have time to pray because there's people in this room that need a miracle. There's people in this room, you need God to intervene today. And I believe if your faith will be encouraged, and if your faith will be invested in the right place, God will do it. If you believe. So this morning, I'm not going to ask anybody to bow their head. I'm going to get my oil. Taylor's going to come help me, Ray. And if you have a need today that seems impossible, I want you to line this front, and we're just going to pray. We're going to anoint you with oil, and we're going to pray, and we're going to do what the old timers used to call tearing the altars. And we're going to tear in the altars till you get a breakthrough. We're going to tear in the altars till you get your healing. Because I believe the God of the impossible, the God of the miraculous, is in the house today. Where's your faith today? How will you answer that question? If you need God to do something in your life,